Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I want to look at three graphic works of Anne Carson, the Canadian classicist, poet, essayist, artist, translator, professor, an all-around treasure to the North American continent, not just the Great White North. Actually, the whole cosmos benefits from Anne Carson's work. There are defining moments in the lives of all readers. There's that moment when you first read Borges. There's that moment when you first read Virginia Woolf, when you grasp the metaphysical romanticism of Emily Bronte, when you read Proust for the first time, Joyce. And then there's that moment when you discover Anne Carson. And that will forever be a flag in the ground of the timeline of your beautiful life as a reader. The first thing I would say about Anne Carson is that not only is she a gifted writer in her own right, a gifted translator, on and on and on, but I would say that she is a perfect entryway to reading and appreciating and understanding the ancient Greeks, the ancient Greek epics and tragedies. In fact, two of the three books that I'm talking about here come straight from Euripides, of course, filtered through Carson's keen, incisive, clever, hyperactive, idiosyncratic idiom. If you're one of those people who loves to read and you've started to get this sort of impulsion to go back and study the foundations of Western literature, go back and read Iliad, Odyssey, go back and read Euripides and Aeschylus, but maybe you've tried a couple of texts and you just can't get into it. Maybe you've even read some introductions to Greek tragedy and you understand the form and the purpose of a chorus and why it can be so jarring to us today. Maybe you've even studied James Campbell, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, or other books that show how important the Greek myths are, but you just haven't been able to get a grip on it and appreciate it and acclimate to it. Well, Anne Carson is probably the best bet. She is excruciatingly clever and creative. In fact, she's one of those who, when you handle her works, and I'm going to say handle because it's more than just reading, as we'll see in a second, there are tactile dimensions to her work. As soon as you come into contact with it and start grazing your eyes on it and running your fingertips along its tangible forms, you will find yourself wanting to produce the same kind of art. And that to me is the mark of a great artist, when they compel us to want to produce something that they've produced. We can sense that touch of the sublime. Carson's humor and sense of irony really bespeaks the mastery she has over these ancient masters and their works that she studies and teaches and translates. She is also what I'm going to call a conjurer of pith, because Anne Carson can effect any emotion that she wants to with a single brief line. The more you read her, the more you get close to her work, the more you realize that language and myth are endless corridors in which we can wander and play. First up is Knox from 2010. I can't believe that I'm reading this 11 years after it came out. This is a book in a box, just like New Directions also put out B.S. Johnson, The Untouchables. But this book in a box is interesting because it has an accordion link of pages in here. At first, I thought that, like Trojan Women and H Playbook, which is her latest two books from New Directions as well, I originally thought that Knox was just one of her translations of one of the ancient Greek tragedies or something like that. In fact, it is a memoir of her brother named Michael. And he ran away early on in their home life. He ran away from Anne and their mother and never returned. And he was all over the map. And the reason he ran away was to evade imprisonment. And Anne, would get letters from him with these stamps from all these places all over the world. He never did contact and talk with his mother. Their mother died without talking to him again. And then eventually Anne found out 2 weeks after his death from his widow in Denmark that he had died. She ended up going to Denmark and spending time with the widow, during which time the widow produced a bunch of journal entries and old photographs of her brothers. And we learn that he was in love with this epileptic girl named Anna, and she was the love of his life, as hard as that knowledge must have been for his widow there in Denmark to bear. But the whole thing is real life. So this is really a memoir. However, in Carson's hands and steeped in ancient Greece as she is and classical myth, it just maps so perfectly this tragedy in her own life to the tragedies that the Greeks asserted for us right at the foundations of Western culture. The interesting thing about the physical, tangible, tactile form of this book in a box is that it gives the reader the effect of going up into a dusty attic and finding an old shoebox and opening it up and sifting through old photos and scraps of handwritten paper. Lots of these little scraps of paper have apparently been balled up, but then uncrumpled and smoothed out as well as possible. And I'll show you some closer footage of this stuff, but it's amazing. I mean, the detail at which these reproductions are done by New Directions. It's just like their Gorgeous Nothings book from Emily Dickinson's envelope poems, which I've savored for years and years. I don't know the technology that New Directions uses. I would love to find out at a very detailed level. But these reproductions look so real that I often found myself running my fingers over the pages, thinking that I would feel the texture that we can see. But in any case, it just gives that effect of looking through these old artifacts and conjuring up memories. There's a real theme of stirring up memories and stapling them all together. Staples show up in here a lot, and you see the front and the back of them as you turn the page. Sort of stapling them together to make this coherent form. The first thing that Anne is trying to do with this book, Knox, which she calls her attempt to create an epitaph for her brother in book form, is she's questioning what is history. And of course, the father of history is Herodotus. So Herodotus and his histories feature very prominently in here, and she's following his tack. Now, interestingly, the left-hand side, as you're flipping through this accordion book in a box, you'll get these lexical entries of all these ancient words, and then there are many different possible translations. Well, towards the end, you find out that what you've actually been reading word by word is the original of Catullus, or Catullus, his 101st poem, which is an elegy to his brother. So then when you make that connection and you realize what you've been reading, and Carson talks about how she had been trying to translate it for years and years, but nobody, even in Latin, can find the right diction to accord with Catullus. It's a moment when you realize what these words are constituents of, and then you see her attempt, her finalized attempt at the Catullus translation in English. There's a moment of what the ancient Greeks called epiphany. It forms a lock against oblivion. And what she's talking about is that when we give people a history, when we give them a center, and we can make a story out of them and thus sense out of them, such as she's trying to do with her brother, what we're doing is we're forming a lock against oblivion, as she calls it. She examines the first sentence from our father of history, and she says, the first sentence of history has no main verb. What action links Herodotus to extinctions and vanishings? The historian does not exactly say. What a powerful moment that only really someone who is deeply steeped in the study and the language of the ancients could tease out for us. My wife had to keep asking me if I was okay, because as I was reading through Knox, I kept getting so emotionally stirred by the depths that Carson is able to brush at and evoke within myself. Even though I haven't lost a brother, I've known loss in general. I too can't really understand what history is and how to look at a life that's now gone and say something about it and capture something that would be like the essence of it, which is no less than what Carson strives for in this very, very heartfelt, blisteringly creative, and longingly and lovingly constructed work of art. This one came out early in 2021. This is a big comic book representation of the Trojan women by Euripides. This is in a totally different vein than Knox, which is way more on the personal, intimate, emotional level. This one is very much a comic. We have illustrations by Rosanna Bruno. On the back, it says that she is an artist who makes paintings, comics, and bad puns. You just see all of these hilarious illustrations throughout, like Trojan Bride magazine, and it shows all these different things that you would normally see on a magazine, and it says like 14 clever wife hacks, how to avoid his ... see more on page 8, and then it'll say special edition styles you already predicted, 10 tips on treating him like a king on page 12. There's also this picture of some overalls, and on the patch on the bib of the overalls looks like the Carhartt logo, but it says Warheart because this is, after all, ancient Greece, right after the sack of Troy. It follows the fate of 3 Trojan women after the sack of Troy: Hecabe, Andromache, and Cassandra. The book well represents what I'm calling Anne Carson's delight in anachronism, as we'll also see in H Playbook. Part of this anachronism is that Carson has no problem having GPS or Airstream trailers in ancient Greece. She has no problem with having Heracles quote from Shelley's poetry. Like I said earlier, she mixes so easily and so playfully the ancient Greek idiom and the modern English idiom in a way that just keeps you delighting in the work, just as she's delighting in the anachronism and the bathos that's affected. The illustrations and the joy and humor that they create on the page sort of reminded me of the illustrations to Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, which often are just a hilarious representation of Stein's words. And yet, in the midst of all the comic book style fun, Carson is no less profound, no less poetic and striking, with such lines that she translates as, "Even the wind was stained with blood for years." At one moment, she says, "Troy is extinct and no birds sing." Surely that "and no birds sing" is an allusion to Keats, the La Belle Dame sans Merci. And finally, H Playbook, which came out later in 2021. And this is again sort of like the work that she did 11 years earlier in Knox. It's not a book in a box, but she uses these little scraps of paper and these hand drawings, some paint, different materials, and they're beautifully reproduced in here, again, like the work that New Directions did on Emily Dickinson's envelope poems and like was done for Knox. H Playbook is a translation, again, of Euripides, of a piece called Heracles, about Heracles. And Heracles has left Thebes to go on his labors, as they're called. And these labors are basically him, the warrior that he is, going and defeating foes, slaying monsters and all of this. Well, in Thebes, he has left behind his wife, 3 children who are all mute, and his father. Lycos is there in Thebes, and he's a tyrant, and he's terrorizing Heracles' family. They're on the brink of death at his hands, and they're all anxiously awaiting Heracles' return home. And in fact, he does return home, but in true ancient Greek style, there is an ironic tragedy that ensues. And then in comes Theseus, who is Heracles' friend, to sort of wrap everything up, which to me, again, bespeaks that ancient Greek and ancient Roman thinking towards the importance of friendship, even over marriage and primary family. Again, we see Carson delighting in anachronism with characters in ancient Greece quoting Lenin, wearing jackboots, and talking about the meltdown in Chernobyl. But what it really probes is the nature of heroism and the perils of acclamation. Acclamation in this context is sort of like we saw in Shawshank Redemption early on, when one of the prisoners is released back into society and he so cannot figure out how to integrate back into society after how he's lived and what he has known, that he ends up committing suicide. So it's acclamation to a domestic lifestyle versus the warrior lifestyle. It sort of makes us think about Ulysses, finally returning home, or Odysseus finally returning home to Penelope. And then it is Dante, the poet Dante, in his Commedia, which will give him the third journey back on the sea, because in Dante's conception and in many others, there's no way he could have integrated himself back into home life, at least for very long, because of that warrior spirit. It makes you think of the poem. Oh, who is it? Not Keats. Byron? No. Alfred Tennyson. There it is. It makes you think of the poem by Tennyson about Ulysses struggling with this fact that he's just got an intrepid heart that he can't, stay settled for long. However, in the case of Heracles, there are devastating results. Right off the bat, you'll get those mixtures of idioms, such as Amphitryon, who is Heracles' father. He says, "By a thread hangs our fate. H of H, Heracles, is late. We are suppliants at an altar being hounded by the totalitarian cracker who sees power in Thebes." We are all indebted to Anne Carson and to Rosanna Bruno and to New Directions for putting these beautiful, beautiful works of art together in our common journey to understand this existence. If you haven't checked out Anne Carson yet, get ready for one of those defining moments in your life as a reader.